Alienating distanciation, in contrast to the experience of belonging, names the shift that Gadamer makes in hermeneutics, which follows the shift from epistemology to ontology that Heidegger makes in philosophy. This is a move which is in regard to the question we've hit with Schleiermacher and then with Dilthey of having the attempt to have a science or a strict method for understanding in the human sciences give a what, give people, insofar as they are kinds and types who are predictable in accord with causal understanding of the same sort you find in the natural sciences. You get the what, as we've discussed, but not the who. All of hermeneutics, though, while it would end up seeing this as a problem, a surd in its system, a gap that could not be closed, when we studied it in Schleiermacher and Dilthey, all the attention went to the what, to the science of interpretation. Heidegger, of course, and you can think of our stick figure diagram here, even after we complexified that diagram by thinking in terms of not only the words kind of moving between the two figures across empty space, but filling in that page itself with textuality, which separated the speakers and also which gave the speakers the very understandings within which they could interpret themselves. In all of that, the inquiry, we did not address what in Heidegger becomes the central question, and that is the stick figure themselves. What is the sort of entity that understands in this way? In other words, the what is not the focus, but the who. What shifts in Gadamer is suddenly that very method of going to the what is seen as antithetical to true understanding within the area of the human sciences, or maybe what we should better call the humanities, noting the anthropocentrism of the phrase, which is problematic and probably unjustified, and seeing that what, naming it explicitly as problematic, because adopting that attitude, that sense of objectivity and distance, looking for what's universal, what can be a kind. I mean, everything we talked about, which was on the grammatical side of Schleiermacher's interpretive theory, all of that creates this alienating distanciation. In contrast, Gadamer is going to pursue, in a positive way, the way in which the who has to be interrogated in such a way as it unveils understanding, truth that's proper within the humanities, within hermeneutics, when one is trying to connect to the products of whos in intentionality. Your who-ness has to remain there. This is where he's picking up, but complexifying and making far more profound in the center of his attention, the Dilthean notion of like knows like. So the experience of belonging, whereas, and by the way, with regard to human works, the alienating distanciation does not mean there's still not a place for the what. It's just here, instead of the who emerging just as a problem at the end of the day that can't be reconciled, as it kind of did for Dilthey, for Gadamer it becomes the end of interpretation, as I think arguably it had remained for Schleiermacher. But remember, in the 19th century, in the shift from Schleiermacher to Dilthey, the who side of the equation, the technical in the sense of art, or psychological, the divinatory, that side of the equation, gets minimized with the rise of history as a science and the rise of positivism. This is what fuels the rise of the what, which then left a surd, the Irrelevance, the lived experience in both Dilthey and Husserl as the gap that could not be closed. Heidegger, again, refocuses attention on that who, notices that it is a unique and distinct and amazing and complex phenomenon that is presumed in all of these other hermeneutical and scientific studies, but never addressed as such. So again, that's the shift to ontology, the shift to the question of the being of being. What is the sort of being that understands, that lives in this way? The experience of belonging, one way to think of it, very helpfully, I think, is the Gadamerian notion of the fourth wall coming down. When you watch a play, for instance, or view a painting, the play is maybe the easiest to understand. The play, of course, can be analyzed. The production can be analyzed in all sorts of objective ways. The quality of the sound, the character of the set, the various traditions that are being accessed, use of genre and themes. All those technical things are useful and can help one to appreciate and understand a work of art. But in terms of the humanities, understanding of the play, the participation of the play, and here he's going to play with the word play, only comes when you're actually playing in the play, when the fourth wall has come down, when you're sitting there in the audience and you forget that you're in an audience, you forget you're watching a play, the fourth wall comes down and you are totally taken up into the action. In the same way when you play a game, and this is Gadamer, not me. We're going to work with this word spiel. When you play a game, you don't think about the game. You don't think about the rules. You move into the game. You don't really get to play the game while you're still learning it. Then you're still thinking too much about the rules. It's only when you forget the rules, forget what you're doing, and just start playing soccer or playing basketball or playing piano or playing the violin. You'll have this experience in these areas. As you gain expertise, you forget what you're doing, even though all the technique and the training and the thought will help you to really understand in these areas. The role of method is not primary. You now have to begin actually to play. The fourth wall comes down. There's a forgetfulness, which is the forgetfulness of everything which constitutes the alienated distanciation, and suddenly you have an experience of belonging. And this is really where the truth of the work of art, the painting not just as an object of study to be categorized, but the painting in the way it seizes you, is what is significant. This is the fundamental contrast that Gadamer brings, where he takes Heidegger and applies him in this area of interpretation. In this sense, the experience of belonging is what he's going to unpack below. So we've gestured to it now, the fourth wall coming down. But what are the characteristics of this dynamic? When we get to the ontology of consciousness and the letter D on my outline, where we talk about historical distance, no view of whole, no absolute restriction on horizon, fusion of horizons, that's where we'll be unpacking what that experience is, where the fourth wall comes down. So that, in a nutshell, is some of the significance between the contrast that Gadamer draws between alienating distanciation versus experience of belonging. Okay, to complete this, I simply want to read a couple of key quotes. This is from the first paragraph under the alternative, Gadamer, the Hermeneutics of Tradition. This experience is the scandal constituted on the level of modern consciousness by the sort of alienating distanciation which is not merely a feeling or a mood, but rather the ontological presupposition which sustains the objective conduct of the human sciences. The methodology of these sciences ineluctably implies an assumption of distance, and this in turn presupposes the destruction of the primordial state of belonging, without which there would be no relation to the historical as such. And then the final line of that paragraph, the theory of historical consciousness, which is what I'm treating under letter D in our outline, is therefore an epitome of the work as a whole and a microcosm of the great debate. Turning now to the primacy of judgment. About 2 pages into the Gadamer section, in the paragraph that begins, "So far as Gadamer is concerned," you'll find some of the key lines for this. For prejudice in the double sense of precipitation, I'm quoting Ricoeur now, to judge too quickly, and predisposition to follow custom or authority, is the category par excellence of the Aufklärung. Prejudice is what must be put aside in order to think, in order to dare to think, according to the famous adage, sapere aude, dare to think, so that one may reach the age of adulthood or Mündigkeit. So that is an ideal of the Enlightenment, that to become an adult, to think for yourself, that's what it is to be truly enlightened. And that means both not to think too quickly, but to, following the epistemological emphases we've been looking at, to think with reason, with care, to evaluate how well you can know what you know, to take care to be objective and dispassionate and disengaged, not allowing personal interest or prejudice or habit or custom to dictate what you think. If you do that, then you're thinking precipitately, too quickly, and or you are not thinking for yourself. In a word, this is key to what it is to be critical in the modern epistemological sense. This is a sense in which, as Ricoeur says, modern philosophy is a philosophy of judgment because it opposes reason to prejudice. And of course, this sounds very familiar to us still today. As I said in the last class, it's an ideal. Don't be ethnocentric. Don't just do things because that's the way you've always done it. That's the way your culture or your family or whatever your tradition is happened to do it. That's an appeal to authority in a fallacious sense. What you need to do is to think for yourself, to establish things not as true because we've always thought they were true, because some authority simply says they're true, but because we're able to establish their truth, thinking ourselves critically and objectively. Once we are thrown in the sense we realize we are, in Heidegger, once we understand ourselves to be wholly encased within the parameters of the contingencies of the language which we inhabit, in a sense, which we are in terms of our understanding, once we realize all of our understanding is contingent in the way we've been stressing, we realize there is no way to find this objective, dispassionate, universal perspective from which to view reality and to make judgment. Today, this is kind of commonplace in a pop sense of everything being relative to culture, everything being culturally relative or morally relative. This is understood commonly in culture today, except usually for the sciences, which are in a more complex way also eventually involved in this. But already Gadamer, writing in the 50s, is seeing this problem, that the ideals and goals of the epistemological project, which grounded ethics, or at least the attempts to derive an ethics from some form of certainty, which were the ideal attempts for political theory. So the so-called legitimization crisis in politics, the debates over sovereignty, the crisis of foundation in ethics, all of these things are a function of this realization. By now, in the 21st century, early 21st century, this is widely seen as an issue. Gadamer was already discerning the significance of this issue in the 1940s and 1950s. That's what makes his work so significant, in part, is he already had seen what was at stake, and he's seen what's at stake in Germany right after the Holocaust. So for him, it's not going to be sufficient, as some of the people we will read later will conclude, is the best we can do. For him, it's just not going to be sufficient to say, well, there really is no ethical reality. There is no way of privileging one position over another with reason. So it's all just subjective. It's all just a matter of power plays. He simply cannot say that in the wake of the Holocaust. So what he does is, and this is not just a rhetorical ploy, he names the Enlightenment's prejudice against prejudice. This doesn't mean that he wants to affirm precipitate judgment or simply doing something because you've always done it. He is going to attempt to rehabilitate the phenomenology of prejudice, tradition, and authority in order to be able to articulate a reasonable way to talk about truth in the humanities, in the sphere of political science and of ethics and so forth, after the primacy of judgment has been placed in question, has been displaced. So, in other words, the point of the primacy of judgment here is it's undercut. And Gadamer realizes it's undercut, and he realizes the stakes, and he's prescient in this respect. That's what makes him so significant. And that's what takes us to our next letter C category of the phenomenology of prejudice, tradition, and authority. Is there a way he can bring back something in the way of prejudgments, which is not arbitrary, which is not simply a throwback to power plays of one's tradition arbitrarily put up against others, but somehow is reasonable in some way? That will be the challenge of moving beyond the need to abandon philosophy which affirms the primacy of judgment. This brings us then to letter C, a phenomenology of prejudice, tradition, and authority. In the Enlightenment, of course, and for modern philosophy, prejudice and appeals to tradition and appeals to authority are all seen as disqualifying in terms of one's reasonableness. Given the thrown character of our being, we understand, as Ricoeur puts it in the paragraph that begins Gadamer's attempt to rehabilitate, a few lines down where it says, now I'm quoting Ricoeur, for Gadamer, prejudice is not the opposite pole of a reason without presupposition. It is a component of understanding linked to the finite historical character of human being. And the famous line in relationship to that finite human character, the finite historical character of human being, the famous line is from a couple of pages before that Ricoeur cites, now quoting Gadamer, that the prejudices or prejudgments of the individual, far more than their judgments, constitute the historical reality of their being. Or in other words, as Ricoeur rephrases it a few sentences later, history precedes me in my reflection. I belong to history before I belong to myself. And to the degree you've understood how Dilthey, in unfolding the way in which we are understand ourselves in the terms available to us wherever and whenever we happen to be born, and so in the Heideggerian sense of our thrownness into the contingency, in other words, it just happens to be this way, just happens to be this language, of a certain language and understanding, to that degree, history precedes me. And so it's not simply that, critical theorists like to be objective and to oppose prejudice to reason. It's that it turns out that notion of reason being opposed to prejudice, it turns out that that's unthinkable because it's linked to a notion that we can adopt a objective universal perspective. And once one recognizes the way in which all understanding, all of our understanding is a consequence of where we happen to be thrown into the flow of understanding, the flow of textuality. And this is where hermeneutics is not just about language, let alone just about text, but is about textuality as such. This means that there's no longer any possibility of opposing reason to prejudice, because there's no one who is not wholly taken up in prejudice. But Gadamer is looking to say this doesn't mean that we're left with a radical relativity or a complete inability to make judgments. There are still reasonable ways to make judgments within this context that we now find ourselves. And that's how he's going to rehabilitate um, tradition, prejudice, tradition, and authority. Prejudice now more in the sense of prejudgments. He thinks that within the terms of the modern Enlightenment epistemological distinction between reason and prejudice, it was common, Gadamer says, and Ricoeur discusses this, to identify obedience with blind obedience and authority with domination. In this sense, both of these were ways in which one could fail to think for oneself and to proceed in a fashion which is prejudiced and fallacious. Gadamer looks to split that tie between authority and domination and to distinguish between obedience and blind obedience. And that's the key of what he's saying in the paragraph that's offset and cited, the long paragraph from Gadamer that Ricoeur cites, where he says that the authority of other persons is not just a function of blind obedience or necessarily domination, but can be a product of recognition. So I recognize the authority of the oncologist, and I follow, obey the dictates of what the oncologist says to do. And this is not unreasonable. This is involved in prejudgments. It is certainly obedience, but it's not a blind obedience. It is rather a function of a recognition of the due authority of this person in this regard. And I can give a rational story about how medicine has gone through experimental periods, and oncology has been researched, and this doctor has had to go through certain certification, and the treatments have been proven out by methods which have shown to be effective. In other words, even though we're working contingently within tradition with regard to the authority of the doctor and obedience to following the treatment plan that the doctor puts forward, this is not domination. This is not blind obedience. This is not prejudice in any sense, which is inappropriate. And to the contrary, this would be a prejudgment about the authority of the doctor, which is wholly appropriate and wise, even if there's no objective, universal perspective from which it can be defended. One can't be certain about the doctor or the treatment, but there's no reasonable reason for doubt. What's dropped here is the Cartesian standard of logical doubt. So until you have absolute certainty, until you can start from a point of certainty and then work your way up, measuring the degree to which you do and don't know things, but that idea of certainty endures. That certainty we can't have, but we can still have, even within the stream of history, based on experience. So this has an empirical dimension. Even we can make more and then less reasonable conclusions. And by that I mean conclusions about authorities, conclusions about obedience, which again are a function of not blind submission or domination, but recognition. Now, in the next paragraph, after this offset quote, Ricoeur, who again retains epistemological ambitions, it seems to me, talks about this move being a place where Gadamer can bring in the concept of recognition as a critical moment, in the sense of critical theory, in the sense of modernity and epistemology and Kant's critique. This again, I think, is Ricoeur, which is why In the very first word of the second next paragraph, he says, however, because in fact Gadamer does not claim this as a moment of a critical moment, a moment for the critical to come into play. That is Ricoeur's hang up. And when Gadamer says that Dilthey can't move past the theory of knowledge, right, the necessity to have the critical in order to be legitimate, at this point Ricoeur betrays in this paragraph that he's not quite able to move past or just simply abandon that theory of knowledge either. This is where Gadamer, as Ricoeur himself admits with this, however, Gadamer remains more consistent because he doesn't appeal to the critical, as Ricoeur is about to say. Instead, what he ultimately underlines is the relationship of authority and tradition, which is what I just did when I talked about oncology research, certification for the doctor, the history of disease. That's all an appeal to traditioned understanding. That's the sort of appeal Gadamer made. And again, as I said, in the background of that appeal is no pretension to absolute, certain, universal knowledge. But nonetheless, it is an appeal which is reasonable, in which those prejudgments give us a reasonable way of allotting authority and deciding when to be obedient. And that's how Gadamer links it to tradition. He does it in many ways also with law, because in law it is common to, this is common law, right? This is how common law functions. Laws which are on the book for a long time, or customs in a society, can gain what's known as common law status. Doesn't mean they're absolutely right by any means, and sometimes it's turned out that they're quite oppressive, and then we have new laws come up that change them. Nonetheless, within legal theory, no one attacks common law or legal precedent as appeals to fallacious appeals to authority or to tradition or a blind obedience to what's gone before. That gives us some parallel for how Gadamer wants to move forward and think in terms of all the humanities. Now Gadamer, and here he's at odds with the Anglophone philosophical tradition, which really has no place for free will as such. For Gadamer, in this sense, traditions have to be taken up. One has to decide to follow a tradition. One can decide to change. The point is not that we don't have any freedom. It's that we don't have the ability to step wholly out of history, the prejudgments which by far constitute the historical reality of our being, and judge from nowhere. Now, Ricoeur doesn't talk about it, but in the context of this discussion, and it's actually kind of surprising to me that Ricoeur doesn't talk about it, Gadamer brings up something that's known as the classical example. So now that we can't go to a place which is objective and universal, now that sort of God's eye view is not accessible to us, and that was what was needed if you were going to have a philosophy of reason which was going to be opposed to a philosophy which was contingent and it involved prejudgments or prejudices. Now that we can't go to that God's eye view, nor make appeals to something from outside of a history to ground ourselves, right? So at this point, all the world's scriptures are also implicated in this. Even if there is a God who directly reveals God's self, let's say it's even verbal inspiration, the actual words, nonetheless, those words, this would be a way it could apply to the Quran, where you have a real verbal dictation theory of Scripture, which also you have in some Protestant circles. Even if that's the case, the words within which God reveals God's self, by definition, have to fall into history. They have to be expressed within the confines of the words available in that time and place. So everything we're talking about obtains, even if you have really the strongest possible conception of divine inspiration. In any case, what Gadamer appeals to, so that it's a reasoned appeal to tradition, is what he calls the classical example, and this allows him to get sort of an imminent transcendence. These classics are texts which transcend their time. Their texts or their art or their music, text in the broadest possible sense, which has proven itself to be meaningful in usually the time in which it was composed or written or said, but also it remains pertinent and something which people find to be revelatory and productive and useful towards what is enjoyable, good, loving, beautiful in diverse times, over diverse periods, in diverse contexts of joy, contexts of horror, contexts of prosperity, contexts of anxiety. These sorts of texts which transcend their time and remain pertinent over multiple different times, especially in multiple different places. I mean, this is what a classic is, which means that these classics somehow, it's reasonable to think they're touching something which in a way transcends their moment. And that means that gives a basis. That doesn't mean they're inerrant or they're infallible, but it does give a reasonable basis for giving them privilege and authority in our own time. Now, of course, one of the things about a classic is it's difficult, and this is kind of known in one's own time, to know what's going to prove to be classic, because what is classic is only proven over time. We can make guesses that this or that will be classic. In Mozart's day, for instance, he was not recognized the way he is as being so much of so far more brilliant a composer than were many of his compatriots. That is a judgment that in that sense, history makes. On this basis, of course, all the world's scriptures, especially the portions of the world's scriptures which are most often appealed to and cited and reflected upon, have earned this classic status. So on this basis, it is as unreasonable and to reject Plato or Aristotle. It's as unreasonable to reject Scripture, the Bhagavad Gita or the Pentateuch or the Gospels. It doesn't mean any of these things are inerrant or infallible, but it does mean they have a like status of the other classics that we have. So this is not on my outline either, because I was following Ricoeur, but actually I think I should add the classical example in my explanation of it, because it's absolutely pivotal in Gadamer. It's how he will legitimate distinguishing amongst laws and legal traditions and affirming them, and holding up various philosophical and literary and other traditions. It's a key concept. And again, I think Ricoeur does not pursue it, or at least I suspect he does not pursue it, because Ricoeur is holding on to a desire for that critical moment. He still has those epistemological ambitions. At least remember, at the time he wrote this, which is in the early 1970s. And so this is where Gadamer is so prescient, where he is still addressing issues we're thinking about, people are struggling with today, already doing it in the 1950s. And of course, just to put this back in play, I don't think it's insignificant. He is in a context immediately post-Holocaust, right? And he has lived as an adult. He's in his 40s. He has lived not agreeing, but quietly surviving the Nazi reign. He's not like Heidegger or Schmidt, Carl Schmitt, people who actively participated in the Nazi Party. Gadamer did not do that. But nonetheless, he is in the wake of that, and he is simply not going to be able to settle for a philosophy which does not have some way of giving the judgment that the Nazis were wrong and the Holocaust was evil real weight. And his appeal to the classical example, insofar as this sort of treatment of vulnerable people is seen in multiple traditions across time and across history, all would judge this wrong. That gives that judgment real weight in his view, even though it remains historically relative. It's still within that sort of an immanent transcendence. That's the weight of the classical example. That's how he's going to appeal to tradition in a reasonable way, in a way that can rehabilitate then these certain prejudgments, not just every prejudgment, but these certain prejudgments, in a way that has recognition and leads to an association of affirmation of prejudgments, which is certainly not blind or a submission to domination.